The wardroom of HMS Hood smelled of gun oil and fresh paint. Officers sat around the long table, but nobody was eating. The ship's ventilation fans hummed in the overhead. A steward stood motionless by the pantry hatch, a coffee pot in his hand. Forgotten. Admiral James Somerville stood at the head of the table, hands flat on the chart spread before him. He had just told them what they were going to do. Not a single man in the room looked at him. Some stared at the tablecloth. Others looked at the bulkhead. One officer, according to later accounts, simply closed his eyes. Outside, through the armored scuttles, the harbor at Gibraltar shimmered under Mediterranean sun. The Rock threw its long shadow across flat, calm water. Warships swung gently at their moorings. Everything about the scene suggested peace. Nothing about what Somerville had just said was peaceful. In 36 hours, the guns of this ship, the largest warship in the Royal Navy, 42,100 tons of armored steel carrying 8 15-inch guns, would be pointed at the French fleet, at men who had been their allies 3 weeks ago, at men some of them knew by name, at men whose ships had sailed alongside Hood through North Atlantic gales just 7 months earlier. It was June 30, 1940, and Somerville had just been given the most terrible order any British admiral would receive in the entire war. The order came from the Admiralty, endorsed by Winston Churchill himself. It was straightforward in language and devastating in implication. The French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir, the naval base outside Oran in Algeria, was to be given an ultimatum: join the British and keep fighting Germany. Sail under escort to a British port and have your crews sent home. Sail to the French West Indies or the United States and have your ships placed beyond German reach, or scuttle within 6 hours. If the French refused all 4 options, Somerville was to destroy them. Every ship, every gun. These were the same ships that had been patrolling the Atlantic alongside Hood just 7 months earlier, the same ships whose officers had exchanged warm signals and photographs with his own crew. Somerville read the order, and then he did something almost unheard of for a flag officer in wartime. He protested. He told the Admiralty that the use of force should be avoided at all costs. The Admiralty's reply was a single line. The firm intention of His Majesty's government is that if the French will not accept any of your alternatives, they are to be destroyed. On the night of July 2nd, as Force H prepared to sail, another message arrived. It came from the First Sea Lord, Dudley Pound, though it is often misattributed to Churchill. You are charged with one of the most disagreeable and difficult tasks that a British admiral has ever been faced with, but we have complete confidence in you and rely on you to carry it out relentlessly. Multiple accounts record that Somerville received this signal with a heavier heart than the sender surmised. It was encouragement dressed as an order, and it carried an unmistakable subtext. Do not hesitate. Do not hold back. Destroy them. This is the decision that defines Somerville on this channel. Not because it was his decision, it was not, but because of what it cost the man who had to carry it out. If you have seen the earlier video on Mers-el-Kébir from the French perspective, you know what happened to the ships on the receiving end. This video is about the man who gave the order to fire, what he felt before, during, and after, what he wrote to his wife that night, why he called himself the unskilled butcher of Oran, and whether, as some accounts suggest, he tried to reach out to the families of the men his guns had killed. To understand why Somerville was the wrong man for this job, and why that made it worse, you need to understand who he was before July 1940. He was not cold. He was not detached. A crewman aboard Hood described him as a showy admiral with a blue sense of humor, an alert brain, and a habit of keeping his men on their toes. His contemporaries called him charming, intelligent, energetic, and competent. He was the kind of officer who could walk the lower decks and talk to ordinary sailors without a trace of condescension, then sit down with an admiral and argue strategy with equal confidence. He inspired genuine affection, not just respect. Donald McIntyre, in his biography, Fighting Admiral, describes a man who combined natural authority with an unusual warmth. Somerville was serious about the Navy, but never entirely serious about himself. He had been invalided out of the service in 1939 with suspected tuberculosis, then recalled when war broke out because the Navy could not afford to lose experienced flag officers. He was 60 years old, but physically vigorous, and his tactical mind was among the sharpest in the fleet. By June 1940, France had fallen in 6 weeks. The armistice with Germany had been signed on June 22nd. Marshal Petain's government at Vichy was cooperating with the occupiers. And the question of what would happen to the French fleet, the fourth largest navy in the world, had become the most urgent strategic problem facing Britain. The French Navy was not some token force. It included 7 battleships, 19 cruisers, 71 destroyers, and 77 submarines. The modern capital ships, Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Richelieu, and Jean Bart, were among the finest warships afloat. If those ships were added to the German and Italian navies, Britain's control of the Mediterranean, the Atlantic approaches, and the sea lanes that connected the empire would be finished. The entire strategic position of the war depended on those ships staying out of Axis hands. If this kind of naval history is what you have been looking for, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm there is an audience for serious Royal Navy content. Now, back to Somerville. The strategic logic behind Operation Catapult, the code name for the seizure or destruction of the French fleet, was brutal but not irrational. I want to be fair to Churchill here, even though I think the decision was wrong, because understanding why he ordered it is essential to understanding why Somerville's anguish matters. According to Corelli Barnett in Engage the Enemy, more closely, the Franco-German armistice required French warships to return to their peacetime ports and demobilize under German or Italian supervision. Germany offered what Churchill called a solemn declaration that the ships would not be used. Churchill's view of that promise was withering. What is the value of that, he asked. Ask half a dozen countries what a German solemn declaration is worth. He had a point. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and Poland had all learned the value of German promises. Article 24 of the armistice allowed Germany to tear up the agreement at any time, giving Berlin a legal pretext to seize the fleet whenever it suited them. If the Dunkirk and Strasbourg, both modern fast battleships with 8 330mm guns each, were added to the Italian and German fleets, the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean would tip against Britain overnight. The old battleships Bretagne and Provence carried 10 340mm guns each. Together with the rest of the force de raid at Mers-el-Kébir, the French squadron represented a concentration of firepower that Britain could not allow to fall into enemy hands. But strategy was only one layer of Churchill's thinking. There was a deeper game. Churchill's private secretary, Eric Seale, wrote that Churchill was convinced the Americans were impressed by ruthlessness in dealing with a ruthless foe, and that in his mind, the American reaction to our attack on the French fleet at Oran was of the first importance. In July 1940, Britain stood alone. The United States was neutral. Roosevelt was sympathetic, but constrained by an isolationist Congress and an election year. Churchill needed to demonstrate, in the most dramatic terms possible, that Britain was not going to negotiate, was not going to compromise, and was not going to lose. Oran was that demonstration. On July 4th, the day after the attack, Roosevelt told the French ambassador he would have done the same thing. The message had been received. And then there was Parliament. Churchill later admitted that it was not until he stood in the House of Commons on July 4th, announcing what had happened at Oran, that he felt he truly had the support of the chamber. His notes shook in his hands. Tears ran down his cheeks as he spoke. He was not acting. He knew what he had ordered. He knew the cost. When he finished, the House erupted in applause. Conservative members who had regarded him with suspicion for years, who had preferred Chamberlain and distrusted Churchill as reckless and unreliable, rose to their feet. The cry in the lobbies was, "At last, we have a real leader." For Churchill, Oran cemented his political position at the most precarious moment of his premiership. His closing line in that speech was revealing. "I leave the judgment of our action, with confidence, to Parliament. I leave it to the nation, and I leave it to the United States. I leave it to the world and to history." The explicit mention of the United States was no accident. Historian George Melton, in From Versailles to Mers-el-Kébir, has challenged the American signaling interpretation, arguing that Churchill could have more convincingly demonstrated resolve through an attack on the Italian fleet. But this remains a minority view. Most historians accept that even if the American dimension was not the primary driver, it was a significant and calculated benefit. This was the political context. Somerville knew almost none of it. He was not thinking about Roosevelt or Parliament or the destroyers for bases agreement. He was thinking about the men aboard Bretagne. Here is where the tragedy becomes personal. Force H departed Gibraltar on July 2nd, shortly after dawn. The mood aboard the ships was unlike anything the crews had experienced. This was not the tense anticipation of battle. This was dread. Somerville flew his flag aboard Hood, 42,100 tons, 8 15-inch guns, the most famous warship in the Royal Navy. She had been the pride of the fleet for 20 years. Alongside her sailed the battleships Valiant and Resolution, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the light cruisers Arethusa and Enterprise, and 11 destroyers. It was a force powerful enough to destroy any fleet in the Mediterranean, and every man aboard knew that it was sailing to attack friends. Hood's crew had formed genuine bonds with their French counterparts during joint operations. According to the Somerville Papers, published by the Navy Record Society in 1995 and edited by Michael Simpson, Hood and Dunkirk had exchanged very cheery and friendly signals during North Atlantic patrols in November 1939. Gensoul had photographed Hood in rough weather, and prints had sold in their thousands aboard the British ship. Some of Hood's officers had dined aboard Dunkirk. Some had exchanged letters with French officers afterwards. Now the same 15-inch guns that had sailed alongside Dunkirk were being trained on her. The Mediterranean was calm as Force H steamed east toward Oran. The sky was cloudless. The sea was the deep blue that only the western Mediterranean produces in midsummer. It was a beautiful day for what was about to happen. Across the water at Mers-el-Kébir, Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul commanded the Force de Raid. Dunkirk and Strasbourg, each displacing 26,500 tons, and armed with 8 330mm guns. The older battleships, Bretagne and Provence, 23,230 tons each, carrying 10 340mm guns. The seaplane carrier, Commandant Teste, 6 large destroyers, including the powerful Mogador and Volta. Gensoul had no idea what was coming. Negotiations began at dawn on July 3rd. The Mediterranean was calm, the sky clear, the temperature already climbing toward 30 degrees. Captain Cedric Holland, known as Hookie, was sent aboard the destroyer HMS Foxhound to deliver the ultimatum. Holland was a perfect choice in every way except one. He was the former British naval attaché in Paris, fluent in French, described by those who knew him as a delightful person of considerable natural charm. He was personally acquainted with Gensoul and several of the French officers. But he was a captain, not an admiral, and Gensoul, standing on protocol in the middle of a crisis that would determine whether men lived or died, refused to receive him. He sent his flag lieutenant, Bernard Dufay, instead. Holland handed over the British terms. The preamble read, "It is impossible for us, your comrades up to now, to allow your fine ships to fall into the power of the German enemy." This is the part the official history tends to rush through, but it matters. The negotiations dragged on for hours in the growing heat. Holland sat aboard Foxhound, sending messages through Dufay, trying to make Gensoul understand that these were not idle threats. The harbor baked in the sun. French sailors stood at their guns. British sailors stood at theirs, and nobody fired, not yet. Holland described Gensoul in his report as completely service, fervently loyal to Darlin, and somewhat pig-headed. The French admiral viewed the British mining of the harbor entrance during negotiations as an act of bad faith, and it hardened his resolve. His pride prevented the flexibility that might have saved 1,297 lives. And then Gensoul made the mistake that sealed everything. When he signaled the French Admiralty at roughly 9:30 in the morning, he reported that the British had issued an ultimatum to sink his ships or face attack. That was true as far as it went. But he left out the options of sailing to the French West Indies or the United States. These were the very alternatives most compatible with Admiral Darlan's own standing orders to keep the fleet out of German hands. Rear Admiral Lelouch, standing in for the unreachable Darlan, had only Gensoul's truncated report to work from. He ordered resistance and dispatched reinforcements from Toulon and Algiers toward Oran. British intelligence intercepted those reinforcement signals. London immediately told Somerville to settle matters quickly, or he would have additional French forces to deal with. His window of negotiation, already narrow, slammed shut. At 3 in the afternoon, Gensoul finally agreed to meet Holland in person aboard Dunkirk. The meeting seemed to offer a way out. Somerville signaled London with visible hope. "I think they are weakening." He offered extensions, stretching his orders to their breaking point, desperate to avoid what he knew was coming. According to Donald MacIntyre in Fighting Admiral, Somerville was in defiance of his official orders in granting these delays. He was buying time with minutes he did not have. It was not enough. The Admiralty's deadline passed. Holland left Dunkirk. He and Dufay parted in tears. The officer of the watch aboard Bretagne saluted Holland as he departed. Holland later said that the French could not believe they were about to be the targets of British guns. What happened next took 10 minutes. 10 minutes that would haunt Somerville until the day he died. At 5:54 in the evening, according to Hood's after-action report, Resolution and Valiant opened fire. Hood followed roughly 30 seconds later. The concussion of Hood's 15-inch guns was felt throughout the ship, a physical blow to the chest that rattled crockery in the wardroom and set loose items crashing to the deck 3 levels below. The 3 capital ships fired at 17,500 yards, roughly 10 miles, using the Mers-el-Kébir lighthouse as an aiming mark because coastal haze and smoke from the harbor obscured individual targets. A swordfish spotter aircraft circled at 7,000 feet above, calling corrections. Aboard the French ships, the opening salvos arrived with virtually no warning. 15-inch shells travel faster than sound. The first indication for many French sailors was not the noise, but the impact, the sudden violent shudder of steel struck by nearly a ton of high-explosive traveling at over 700 meters per second. The second salvo hit Bretagnes after magazines. I need to be precise about what happened next because precision is what the dead deserve. A column of orange flame erupted skyward, followed by a mushroom of white smoke rising hundreds of feet into the still air. The old battleship, 23,230 tons, carrying a crew of roughly 1,130 men, many of them reservists who had been waiting for demobilization, rolled onto her side and sank within 2 minutes. 977 men went with her. Most of them never reached the upper deck. The ship went so fast that there was no time to abandon. Men were trapped below the waterline in compartments that filled in seconds. The water of the harbor turned black with oil, and then the oil caught fire. Dunkirk was struck by 3 or 4 15-inch shells. Her electrical systems were destroyed, and she lost power. Fire broke out in multiple compartments. Her crew beached her to prevent sinking, but the damage was catastrophic. Provence took a shell aft that caused serious flooding and fire, and her crew beached her as well. The destroyer Mogador had her stern blown clean off when a 15-inch round detonated her depth charges, killing between 38 and 42 men. The explosion was so violent that it left the forward 2/3 of the ship intact, but simply erased the stern. Burning oil spread across the harbor surface. Small boats tried to rescue men in the water, but the oil fires made it nearly impossible. The scene, according to French survivors, was one of absolute horror. Smoke rose in a column visible for miles. Somerville ordered the ceasefire after roughly 30 salvos. 144 15-inch rounds from 3 capital ships fired over 10 minutes. Each shell weighed 870 kilograms. Each one could penetrate more than 300 millimeters of armor at that range. They were designed to sink enemy battleships in open water. They were never intended to be fired at ships trapped in a harbor with nowhere to run. But Strasbourg got out. Captain Louis Collinet, in what I think was one of the finest pieces of ship handling in the entire war, drove his battleship through the smoke of the burning harbor and the mined exit channel at 28 knots, escorted by 5 destroyers. Hood gave chase but could not close the gap. 2 waves of swordfish torpedo bombers attacked without scoring a confirmed hit. Strasbourg entered Toulon at 9:10 the following evening to a hero's reception. Collinet had saved his ship and his crew. It was the only good thing that happened that day. The final toll. Bretagne, 977 dead. Dunkirk, approximately 210 killed across the initial attack and a follow-up strike on July 6. Mogador between 38 and 42. Scattered casualties across the rest of the harbor brought the total to 1,297 French sailors. British losses were 2 aircrew killed when a skua was shot down by French fighters during mine-laying, and 2 men slightly wounded aboard Hood from shell splinters. Now here is what Somerville wrote that night, not the official signal, not the after-action report. What he wrote privately, to the one person he could be honest with. According to Michael Simpson, the editor of the Somerville papers published by the Navy Record Society, Somerville described the attack as the biggest political blunder of modern times and said it will rouse the whole world against us. He told his wife Mary that we all feel thoroughly ashamed and that the first time they had been in action was an affair like this. He wrote, "I just felt so damned angry being called on to do such a lousy job." And then, in what may be the most revealing phrase any British admiral committed to paper during the entire war, he called himself the unskilled butcher of Oran. That phrase has followed him through every history book written since. His personal papers are held at the Churchill Archives Center in Cambridge under the reference GBR 0014 SMVL. They were donated by his son, Commander John Somerville, in 1966 and again in 1983. The collection includes pocket diaries, desk diaries, official papers, telegrams, and private correspondence with his wife, Mary Kerr Mayne. The most significant folder, SMVL3, contains this family correspondence and remains closed to general access. Researchers require explicit written permission from Somerville's grandson, Commander Christopher Somerville. I think that phrase, unskilled butcher, tells you everything about the man. An officer who felt nothing would not have written it. An officer who disagreed with the order but carried it out professionally might have expressed frustration or anger at the Admiralty, at Churchill, at the strategic situation. Somerville expressed shame. He used the word butcher, which is not a military word. It is not a tactical word. It is a moral word. He was not criticizing his own marksmanship or his gunnery officer's aim. He was condemning the act itself. And the word unskilled adds another layer. He was saying he had done this terrible thing, and he had not even done it well. Strasbourg had escaped. The killing had been incomplete. He was a butcher who could not even finish the job. And there is evidence, noted in his personal papers, that he deliberately held back. He admitted to his wife that he had not been quite as aggressive in the destruction as he could have been. In my view, this is Somerville trying to salvage something from an impossible situation. He could not refuse the order, but he could choose not to pursue Strasbourg with maximum effort. He could choose to cease fire after 10 minutes, rather than continuing until every French ship was destroyed. He could restrain his own violence within the limits of obedience. He saved what he could of his conscience, even if it was not much. The question that brings us to the heart of this video is whether Somerville went further than private anguish, whether he wrote to the families of the French dead, whether he tried, in some private way, to acknowledge what his guns had done to their husbands and sons and brothers. The honest answer is that we do not know, not from the published record. Churchill, in their finest hour, tells a story about 2 peasant families near Toulon who lost sons to British fire at Oran and asked for the Union Jack to lie on their coffins alongside the tricolor. It is a powerful anecdote, and it has sometimes been connected to Somerville's personal intervention. But the story appears in Churchill's own narrative voice, not attributed to Somerville or any specific British officer. Whether Churchill heard this through Somerville's channels, through intelligence, or through diplomatic contacts is unclear. If personal condolence letters exist, the most likely place to find them is the restricted SMVL3 folder at the Churchill Archives Center. Bill Whiteside, who gained access to these restricted papers in 2012, described the folder as the mother lode of information and captured over 700 images during 3 days at Cambridge. His findings shaped his book, Operation Catapult, published by the U.S. Naval Institute Press, which represents the most recent and thorough archival treatment of the attack. The Arthur Marder papers at the University of California, Irvine, may also contain relevant correspondence, as they include letters from Admiral Gensoul, from Commander John Somerville, and from numerous British and French officers who wrote about these events in the years after the war. What we can say with confidence is this: everything in the public record points to a man who carried the weight of Mers-el-Kébir for the rest of his life. It was not a burden that faded with time or success. It shaped his relationship with Churchill, which never recovered its warmth. It colored his subsequent command decisions in ways that are visible across the rest of his career. Every time Churchill questioned his aggression at Cape Spartivento in the Indian Ocean, the ghost of Oran was in the room. Somerville had shown that he would obey orders he found repugnant, but he had also shown that he would not pretend to enjoy it. That combination made him invaluable and inconvenient in roughly equal measure. The French perspective deserves the same narrative care as the British one, because Somerville himself would have insisted on it. Gensoul told his surviving sailors at the funerals that if there is a stain on a flag today, it is certainly not on yours. He never spoke publicly of Mers-el-Kébir again and died on December 30th, 1973. The Vichy government severed diplomatic relations with Britain on July 8th. Admiral Darlan initially ordered retaliatory attacks on British ships everywhere. Pétain overruled him within 24 hours. When ministers pushed for a declaration of war against Britain, Pétain vetoed it with 5 words that carried the exhaustion of an entire nation: "One defeat is enough." Retaliatory air raids on Gibraltar followed on July 5th and again on September 24th. They were largely ineffective, but they sent a message. The attack made it nearly impossible for de Gaulle to recruit French sailors to the Free French cause. Joining the country that had killed more than 1,000 of your comrades was a difficult thing to ask of any man. The wound cut deep into Franco-British relations and would not fully heal for years. But the ultimate vindication of French naval honor came at Toulon on November 27th, 1942. When German forces moved to seize the unoccupied zone of France during Case Anton, French crews at Toulon received orders from Admiral Jean de Laborde to scuttle the entire fleet. They did it. 3 battleships, including Dunkerque and Strasbourg, the very ships Somerville had tried to destroy. 7 cruisers, 15 destroyers, 12 submarines, 77 vessels in total, sent to the bottom of their own harbor by their own crews rather than let Germany take a single hull. For the French Navy, this was proof beyond any argument that the fleet would never have fallen into enemy hands, that the assurances dismissed by Churchill had been genuine, that Mers-el-Kébir had been unnecessary. In my view, this is the strongest argument against Churchill's decision. The French Navy kept its word. It destroyed its own fleet rather than hand it over. Somerville had believed they would, and he had been right. The men he killed at Oran died for a threat that never materialized. Somerville's career after Oran was distinguished but permanently shadowed by Churchill's distrust. At the Battle of Cape Spartivento in November 1940, Somerville engaged an Italian force in the western Mediterranean. When the Italians withdrew under air cover, Somerville broke off pursuit to protect his convoy and his carrier, Ark Royal. Churchill was furious. He wanted aggression. He wanted pursuit. Without even waiting for Somerville's official report, the Admiralty dispatched Admiral of the Fleet Lord Cork to Gibraltar for a formal board of inquiry. It was an extraordinary humiliation for a flag officer in the middle of active operations. Cork, however, arrived at Gibraltar, examined the evidence, congratulated Somerville on his handling of the action, and cleared him completely. The inquiry found his caution prudent and his judgment sound. Churchill was not pleased, but there was nothing to be done. The facts did not support his fury. This was the pattern of Somerville's war: professional excellence followed by political suspicion from a prime minister who valued aggression above caution and obedience above independent judgment. It is not difficult to see Mers-el-Kébir at the root of this tension. Somerville had shown reluctance before Oran, and Churchill never entirely forgave reluctance. Despite this, Somerville's operational record after Oran was remarkable. He bombarded the Italian port of Genoa in February 1941, bringing the war directly to Mussolini's coast. In May 1941, his carrier Ark Royal launched the Swordfish torpedo attack that crippled the German battleship Bismarck, the single torpedo hit that jammed Bismarck's rudder and sealed her fate. He ran the desperate Malta convoys through the most heavily contested waters in the Mediterranean, keeping the island alive when it was under siege from the air. Each of these operations carried echoes of the dilemma he had faced at Oran, the tension between orders from London and reality at sea, the weight of decisions measured in lives. In March 1942, Somerville took command of the Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, where he faced the same Japanese carrier force that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 4 months earlier. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carriers raided Ceylon in April 1942, sinking the cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire and the carrier Hermes. Somerville, commanding an outclassed fleet of older battleships and a handful of carriers, preserved his force by refusing to offer battle on terms that would have resulted in destruction. Churchill, predictably, was displeased. But Somerville's caution saved the Eastern Fleet, and by 1944, with reinforcements finally arriving, he launched offensive carrier strikes against Japanese positions at Sabang and Surabaya. His final wartime appointment was head of the British Admiralty delegation in Washington from November 1944 to December 1945. There he developed an unexpectedly effective relationship with Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, a man described by colleagues as notoriously abrasive and anti-British. Somerville's charm, intelligence, and refusal to be intimidated won King's respect. He was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet on VE Day, May 8, 1945, the highest rank in the Royal Navy. He served as Lord Lieutenant of Somerset in retirement before dying of coronary thrombosis on March 19, 1949, aged 66. He was buried with full naval honors at Dinder House, the family seat. He had outlived the war by less than 4 years. I want to offer a verdict on Somerville at Mers-el-Kébir, because that is what this channel does. We do not just tell stories, we take positions. I think Somerville was the right man to carry out the wrong order. A colder admiral would have opened fire sooner and with less restraint. A man like Cunningham, for example, with his instinct for violence at close range, might have pursued Strasbourg until she was sunk and continued firing until every French ship in the harbor was destroyed. A weaker admiral might have found a way to avoid the action entirely, to stretch the negotiations until nightfall, and then report that the French had offered enough concessions to satisfy the ultimatum. That would have created a constitutional crisis between the Navy and the civilian government at the most dangerous moment in British history. Somerville did something harder than either of those options. He protested, was overruled, and then carried out the order with professional precision while privately condemning it as an atrocity. He held back where he could. He admitted to his wife that he had not been quite as aggressive in the destruction as he could have been. He let Strasbourg escape when a more determined pursuit might have caught her. He ceased fire after 10 minutes when he could have continued for 30. He saved what he could of his conscience, even if it was not much, and he wept where no one could see. He wrote the word butcher next to his own name and carried it for the remaining 9 years of his life. That willingness to feel the full moral weight of what he had done without excusing it, without hiding behind orders, without blaming Churchill or Gensoul or the strategic situation, is what separates Somerville from other commanders who carried out terrible orders in wartime. Whether he wrote to the French families is a question the archives may yet answer. The restricted papers in Cambridge have not been fully published, and the Martyr collection at Irvine has not been exhaustively mined. A future researcher with access to both collections may find the letters, or they may find that Somerville's anguish expressed itself only in the private space between a husband and wife, in letters to Mary that were never intended for history. But even without those letters, the evidence is clear. Somerville felt the full weight of what happened on July 3, 1940. He did not hide from it. He did not excuse it. He did not shift the blame to Churchill or Gensoul or the strategic situation, although he could have done all three with some justification. He called it what it was. And that, in my view, is the measure of the man. The next time you hear Mers-el-Kébir discussed as a strategic necessity, as a cold but rational act of statecraft, remember that the admiral who pulled the trigger called it the biggest political blunder of modern times. Remember that his crew felt dirty and ashamed. Remember that 1,297 French sailors died in 10 minutes. most of them aboard a ship that sank so fast her crew never had a chance to reach the upper deck. Remember that the French Navy proved Somerville right at Toulon 2 years later when they destroyed their own fleet rather than hand it to Germany. And remember that somewhere in a locked folder in Cambridge, in letters that no researcher has fully published, the private thoughts of the unskilled butcher of Oran may still be waiting to be read. The sea off Mers-el-Kébir is calm most days. The harbor has been rebuilt. The wreck of Bretagne was salvaged after the war. There is nothing left on the surface to mark what happened there. But below the waterline, in the silt and the mud, traces remain.